Look, what we were wanting to do in this final session is to talk a bit about some of the pathways to activating this sort of energy which is on the ground, I think, and trying to find ways that that might resonate and give us some sort of both pathways forward, but some optimism about change. I must say that in coming to this point at the end of the day, when we've heard so many grim stories as well as inspiring stories, I am reminded a bit of the process that I went through when I was writing my book, The Idea of Australia, because I was doing a lot of historical research and thinking of how the tendrils of the past played through into the present. I was writing it during the period of COVID, and I took to regarding COVID as a sort of an X-ray that showed where the strengths and weaknesses of the society were. And I must say that at times I got quite depressed. I thought, goodness, I've got to write this in a way which isn't sort of like this is all hopeless, and we've always opted for the less optimistic and outward-looking, engaged and generous response. And there were plenty of signs of that, but it's hard to hold on to that optimism a lot of the time when you look at the sort of detail of the history of this country and the way that we've behaved. And so in the end, I mean, where I got to with that, which is sort of a bit where we're coming to today, was that I looked at the things that were happening on the ground, and there's been some talk today about the strengthening of neighbourhood links, for instance, during the COVID period, that people were connecting. I know there was a lot of bad, but there were some good things, and people were connecting in their local communities quite often in a way that they hadn't done before. We saw that in the movement of the sort of independent campaign then during the election campaign, which was very much a locally based set of political actions. We saw it in the activity around women advocating for their rights, you know, during that 2021 year with Grace Tame and Brittany Higgins and the others sort of really saying, you know, we're not going to be shamed for past stuff that we've been made to feel victims for. And we saw it very much, I think, in the beginning of the truth-telling process as a result of the Uluru Statement, that people are deeply curious about First Nations history of the areas in which they live. They really want to know, and they're trying to find that out. And so that was sort of where I landed in the book. I sort of said, okay, there is a movement on the ground which is happening, which may be transformed. Oops, I think that was. No, it's fine. It's fine. Which may be transformative, and marshalling that energy to be a bit bold about what the future might be is a really important step to be taken. Now, the good examples we've heard today are all about that energy. The bad examples are, oh gosh, it's so complex, we can't do anything about it, let's write another report and put it on a shelf. I think in many ways the big example, and this is why I want to draw you both into this conversation, the big examples are around a different form of sort of engagement. And the Uluru Statement is a spectacular example of sort of deliberative democracy in action, in a sense, because what came out of that process was not what the people who were sent out to do it expected was going to come back. You know, they came back with a very different, very much more considered sort of response. So I'm interested in teasing that out. And Ariadne, in your work, I mean, that's very much, you know, you've written so much about the way the digital tools and the forms of networked engagement actually change how things get done. So it's a free conversation. It's up to you. I'm just sort of interested in how you think about whether there is this energy and this possibility of things moving in a way that maybe they've felt stalled for a long time. Ariadne, do you want to go first? Yeah.
It's on, okay, there you go. Well, I must admit, and I can say it because he's not in the room, when we started the day with Andrew Lee on the screen kind of telling us that there was no community anymore and there was no volunteering anymore, I was a bit despondent, and I thought, well, I don't agree with that, and there's lots of evidence to counter that, and it really depends on the way that you look. And today's been a fascinating day. It's kind of hard to come to the end of the day, and we've all had a lot of lots of data thrown at us and lots of big ideas. But where I was left with was thinking about what are the big ideas we need to be taking away and thinking about? I think we've talked a lot about material difference and material inequity today, and that, speaks to my heart, that we're sort of talking about core issues about equity and health, education, housing, the different experience of climate change. But I think we need to get bigger than that. We need to talk about what kind of society do we want to live in? How do we actually start a conversation about what is the common good? What do we want Australia to actually look like? How do we create the language? And I do think, and Lisa, I hope we'll talk more about this, I think we have that opportunity right now to be talking about that, about the kind of country we want. But it's also some of the other points that were being made, and Peter Shergold made this point quite strongly about that we need to move away from discourses that are based on deficit and disadvantage, and how do we focus more on capabilities and how we want to see the world. But then there was another interesting contradiction about we can't criticise some of the kind of big egalitarian Australian myths around wealth creation and multiple home ownership, like was being pointed out by Tone. We can't really focus on, and one thing that I don't think we've talked about today is the vast varieties and experiences of the workplace and of work and growing precarity and so on. So I think we just need to question some of these big myths of Australian society to come up with the beyond the Andrew Lee story of what community looks like right now, where people find it in moments of political expression and political togetherness and that kind of solidarity as well.
I've got a lot to say. So the fact is that Australia has got almost 50% of its population today as first or second generation Australians. And that means nearly half of us either weren't born here or one of our parents weren't born here. And it's a very different nation today than what was the nation in 1901 when the Australian Constitution was formed. And for those of you who are historians, and this is an important piece of work that was done, right? It was primarily white Anglo-Saxon guys who put together the foundation document of this land, right? And it didn't start on the 26th of January. It was something that commenced on the 1st of January 1901. And when you look at the Constitution today, which basically excluded Aboriginal people from it as being here, or with all of the stuff around, missing links, terra nullius, etc. And we look at our proud, dynamic Australian population today and the extraordinary diversity of us, to interrogate this kind of problem, this kind of issue, and still not have a treaty, and still be one of the richest nations in the world. I don't know about you, but I feel deeply ashamed of my nation. And at the same time, I'm incredibly proud of it because of all of the possibilities. And I'll just do a quick dance through history. So 1901 was the Constitution of Australia. In the years subsequent to that, by the 1930s, there was a very strong Aboriginal movement where people were wanting to have rights to be able to get education, people wanting to have rights to have health, they want to have rights of freedom of movement. Yet many of our capital cities had a nighttime curfew for Aboriginal people, and at the same time, people like me, my grandmother was part of domestic servants just around the corner in the Hyde Park barracks, right? So we had this extraordinary situation that many non-Aboriginal Australians of the day just didn't know, didn't understand, turned a blind eye. There were children being removed en masse, and there were people who were constructing railway trains to be able to take them from Central Station in Sydney to all parts across the state in the New South Wales experience, yet people didn't know. And it was only in recent decades, in the 90s, that people, Henry Reynolds and a few other people started writing these documents that really brought that stuff to the fore. Sir Ronald Wilson, of course, did his absolutely landmark piece of work. And still people were shocked and surprised and felt unable to put a language to how they felt and their grief as good Australians about how could this possibly happen to others in our nation. Of course, we know 1967 referendum was a huge thing, and we're going through all of that debate again and hopefully getting a successful referendum for the next question that gets posed. In the 1970s, we saw the construction of the Aboriginal Medical Services, and that was 51 years ago, 52 years ago, and ultimately people would rather die on the steps of a church than go off to the RPA hospital or to the St Vincent's Hospital of the day. And these are urban people. We had the start of the Aboriginal Legal Services, again, real community movement, real community of partnership where non-Aboriginal people and Aboriginal people got together and made something profound happen. Both of those services are still existing and very, very strong across Australia, and both of those services are best practice exemplars to other places in the world. And then, of course, by the time we got to 1990s, there was the People's Movement of Reconciliation. We were talking about treaty. Yothu Yindi was singing it, and I bet you could even remember half the words, right? But, you know, something happened. By the time we got to 1995, we then started to go down practical reconciliation because, you know, we can't go off and privilege Aboriginal people over others, you know, and this was some of the language that was being used. Aboriginal people were then continued to be vilified, continued to be the victim, continued to be blamed for their own circumstances. And these were terrible times, a very, very dark part of our recent history, which most of us, from the look of you, except for our gorgeous young lady over there, were alive and responsible in those times. And then, of course, by the time we got to the 2000s, the world changed significantly through, you know, circumstances overseas, but we still have not been able to have a discussion about treaty. We still haven't been able to have a discussion that was pragmatic and real about how on earth can we conclude the unfinished business of this land. So when you look at us as an Australian nation with our demographic shift of nearly 50% of us being first or second generations, but also many of us being quite a lot older, we're pushing on to a smaller proportion of younger people problems that we haven't wanted to deal with. We haven't been courageous, right? We haven't been brave. We haven't been consultative. We've gone off and stuck so much stuff in the too hard basket. But her generation, they're going to be dealing with the climate, they're going to be dealing with housing, they're going to be dealing with food insufficiency, water. They're going to be things that are changing our world forever, and we can't even get our acts together and talk about the voice and get that across. Now, I mean, we just have to think about what can we deal with now, because there's going to be a lot for the future, and I feel confident in our youth, especially when I see deadly young ladies like you up here, you know, talking from your heart with strength, courage and passion. But where's ours? How can we be more like her and be brave enough to use our incredibly strong, learned voices to make the changes that many of us have been in conversation about for a long, long time? So that's what I'd really love to leave with you fellas today, you know. We've got a lot to do and we just we cannot conscionably leave it to the next generation to do, because it'll be far too late and it'll be on us.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, one of the things that I think is so important, and that, you know, we really need to break this jam. I mean, I said at the beginning of the day that I used that Linda Colley line about 70 years and 10 being the period that it took for a change. Now, in relation to First Nations people, what we have Jeremy Bentham in 1803 saying that the failure to come to a treaty with the people who were here would be an indelible flaw on this land. Well, you know, here we are, you know, 2022, it's looking pretty indelible. I mean, he was right. But one of the things that I think is really important, and your recap of that sort of historical frame is so powerful in that, is that at every point along the way, it has been contested. At every point there has been argument. I mean, you talk about some of those examples of First Nations activism, but, you know, go back and look at the sort of foundation, the debates around the creation of the Federation. there were people arguing for a very different sort of federation. I mean, not just in terms of there being 17 states and not 6, but in terms of a different sort of politic which was very much more locally grounded, that was engaged, included a Bill of Rights, included different electoral systems. I mean, there were debates that were held at the time, and the people with ideas that we would probably now regard as pretty mainstream were the ones who were marginalised. Now, critics would say, well, it was just as well there wasn't a rights bill that was built into the Australian Constitution, because it would have been pretty ghastly. But nonetheless, I mean, I think that one of the really important things that we need to hang on to in these conversations is that the debates have always been there, and it's time for the other side, in a sense, that's been sitting there having that argument to get a chance to assert its confidence and not to be... I mean, I think that when you talk about the grief of Australians in thinking about the history, I think it's sort of grief. I think that's not a bad word, but I think it's a sort of sense of shame. It's not guilt, it's shame. I mean, that's been the big controlling emotion that's been used very powerfully. And that's part of the reason why I think that the sort of movement around the voice and the movement of those young women especially was saying, we cannot be shamed anymore. It's not our fault. And I think that that's something which connects, I'm trying to bring you in this area, Ariadne, that connects in the way that people engage more directly and intimately, in a sense, through their online activism, because those things which were barriers, which forced silence, actually don't work in this new space.
Thanks for throwing to me on that one. Yeah, I think we're in a moment, and have been at least for 10 years or so, in where we're reimagining the idea of what collective action really looks like. We could talk about it as, the sort of culmination of the networks that we have in our everyday lives, and that social media is an intrinsic part of that for bringing those connections between people. And part of it is kind of reimagining, what does that look like? When I walked in here today, I walked past the Harbour Bridge. I noted that the Aboriginal flag now flies permanently atop the Harbour Bridge. Yep. That happened not because of some benevolent government, it happened because of a long-term petition campaign that started on the website change.org, that then became a broader media campaign. So it was very much from the local. If we want to know how people participate and want to have their voices heard these days, it's through online petitions. It is the act beyond voting that most people, 2/3 of us, are likely to have done, to have that kind of expression of, what we want to see changed, and it's not always aimed at government, can be aimed at local government, state or federal government, can be aimed at a corporation, can be aimed at a school. So I think it's how we imagine how we have our voices heard, and it builds on those networks that we have that are predominantly digital. So I think our discussion today about the importance of local and place-based services is really important, but it's a limited imagination of what community looks like now. People have shared senses of community in different spaces. They'll often find the people who are more like them. Disability activists congregate online. That's where they find people that they organise with to create policy-oriented campaigns and political change. Young people, when they think of how they're going to get active or how they're going to make a statement about something, will start online. And bear with me, I want to do a little anecdote here. When I was binge watching the new TV series of Heartbreak High 2 weeks ago, high recommend, tells you something about education and schools as well. But there was a particular moment where one of their favourite teachers was sacked because of a rumour and smearing campaign that went around, and so the students decided to get active around how could they get that teacher reinstated. So again, the campaign started, it's aimed purely at the school, to a lesser degree at the New South Wales Department of Education. So first thing they do is they start an online petition. Second they do is they start their social media campaign, they prepare their memes that they're going to share around. The third thing they do is organise a sit-in in the school. And I just thought this was a lovely little bit of the kind of normalisation of particular forms of how you get voice, how you express yourself, and how you ensure that you're actually heard. And, and also nicely their parents support them in this act as well. They're kind of standing in the schoolyard while they're doing their sit-in overnight. And I just think we need to think more about those ad hoc moments of political collectivity or community and meaning making more than, the long-term movements for change and the 70 years process are really important, but let's celebrate those smaller wins too.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, that process of the immediate engagement around those issues, and how that can galvanise people and give them the confidence. One of the things that came through in the research of yours that I was reading was that sense that people didn't want to engage with politicians because they felt that they didn't listen. That they'd go and do a consultation, but actually they knew what they wanted to take away from it. They didn't want to actually hear anything. And I mean, I think that this environment we're in now, it's still possible that still happens, but people expect to be heard in a way which is much different to the way it used to be.
Yeah, totally. At its base level, governments need to catch up, and they need to learn from people. They need to learn how to actively listen to people, not within the sort of constraints of their consultation exercise. But governments also need how to actually demonstrate that they've acted based on that listening. It's not enough to just give people a space for voice or to appear that you've listened. Something needs to change as well, and you need to give people a sense of hope or belief or trust in that process that change is really possible. And we're kind of we're a long way from that. I think we're still in that moment where governments are kind of, we can encourage voice in the sort of small sense or encourage that engagement, but they haven't figured out that process. And there was even talk this morning around government collaboration and co-design, and I just think we need to unpick that more and more and sort of, demonstrate where that is genuine processes of co-design, collaboration, co-governance that actually leads to change that does change those entrenched inequities that we've been talking about as well.
But there is a caution, I think.
Yeah, sure.
And, a lot of the dependence on the internet is by having smart technology. And, for some people, they just can't afford it. Yeah. And there's a degree of literacy and there's all of that sort of stuff. That being said, there are a lot of things that we can do to make sure that people are able to be heard. And I mean, in our world, we call lots of things yarning circles, right? Yeah. Or yarning fora. Yeah. And it's really good sometimes to put the technology away and look at someone, and be with them physically and not be distracted by the many things that we do. And for a lot of people that I get to work with, they find it uncomfortable to have a recording device or to be photographed in particular contexts. Rather, they want you to learn from them in a different way and then help them translate that. So I think, the mixed work is what's going to be really important. But the activism, I think that's quite important. But I've seen some of the most atrocious racism of late online. I've seen some of my dearest colleagues being pulled down by invisible people that are using weirdo-beardo names, on these websites that are then being used against them in the most tragic ways. People are becoming sick, unwell, unhinged, and I worry about, we've heard stories of people dying as a result of that kind of cyberbullying. So I see the power of it, but I also see another side of it, which I think is not what we're meant to be doing as a community, is it?
Sure, and I think that's the discussion that we as a community need to have about that broader public good. I mean, online is not a neutral space, but it is the space that we're all in now. Whether or not we're accessing services online, we're engaging with other people online, we're getting our news online. So it is the ubiquitous space, but we should have a discussion about how we want to manage that, about how we want to engage civilly with other people on it. So I would always condemn the kind of hate speech that happens online, of course. Yeah.
One of the, I'm interested, I'll come to you in a minute. One of the things that I think is really striking is to look at how countries change and what the triggers are that make it possible for them to sort of reinvent themselves. There's been quite a deal of research done on this. But in some ways the most striking example, and given the ties between Australia and Ireland are so strong, and Ireland's independence from Britain, was about the same time as our federation. There's a good reason to look at that. And the process that's gone on in Ireland over the last 20 years or so is something quite remarkable. I mean, it's a country which was the most Catholic. It was an impoverished society, beautiful, but and what you've seen over this last 20 years or so, and it's not perfect, but what you've seen is something which has managed to challenge the old institutions and the old frameworks and the old ways of doing things in a way that it is now an extremely progressive. The religious dimension of Ireland is a personal thing, not a state matter in the way that it once was. And I mean, that's happened, I think, in part because of changing economic circumstances. By being in the EU, it got to, have more money than it had once been available. But the very active sort of process of sort of deliberative democracy exercises there has provided a framework which has made it possible for what would have been once unimaginable changes to have occurred. Ariadne, is that something that you've...
Yeah, sure. And I totally agree with you to see quite radical change in conservative Catholic country like Ireland. But I guess what's important is the kind of politics that embodies. It's sort of a politics that's not the toxic adversarial politics that we still have in this country, that is very much that kind of partisan arguing that most people in Australia are turned off. When we ask people why they don't trust politicians, it's their image of bickering politicians who don't always follow through on what they may promise that is resonant with people. So this kind of different model of doing deliberative polls that are driven by consensus, that are driven by discussion, that are kind of shared, it's usually 100 people in a room talking about an issue, engaging with experts over a period of time, and then being asked how they want to, and the famous ones were on abortion law reform and marriage equality. That Ireland had marriage equality before we did, I think is kind of, not what people would have expected, but it was driven by that deliberative process amongst citizens that was then shared, but also there was a commitment to government to take up what people decided in that process. And I think those kinds of... the process is important, but that commitment to creating change and creating politics in a different way and doing it differently that is responsive to what people think and feel is the big shift as well.
I love the way how politics does evolve and how nations do evolve, and I think Australia's sitting right on a precipice of an evolutionary leap, because I think most Australians now are just absolutely over talking about Aboriginal people in the abstract and recognising that they've chosen Australia as home. And there's a whole myriad of reasons for that, but we call this joint home and we all belong here, no matter whether we came last week or 60,000 years ago. We all belong here and we all have a responsibility, and we have a really unique culture in Australia. I mean, you go overseas and you hear the yidaki being played, you know exactly what the instrument is and you know exactly where it's from. You can characterise our Indigenous art beautifully, like people recognise that from a mile away. And that is characteristically Australian, along with our accent and along with all of the other stuff that we have. And we are an incredibly diverse nation and one of the most multilingual nations on earth. And these are astounding things, and I think we're just at that point now of having these sorts of discussions where we're going to eventually say to our politicians, we are the people of Australia, and if you don't do what we ask you to do, what we vote you in, get away from this party political stuff or this thing that they all have to abide by the leaders' rules, we're going to get nowhere fast, because the politics will just change. The closure of ATSIC, for example, sorry, this sounds a bit rambly, but in the 1990s we had this extraordinary organisation called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission. It was the only place Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people could vote for how an organisation, a governance organisation, ran. And when Howard got voted in, one of the first things he did was he just removed it because it wasn't part of the Constitution. There was no voice, there was no place for it to be. And I think this is why the voice is so important for us to all get behind. Regardless of whether or not we don't agree quite with the model, we still agree with the principle, right? And this is the bickering that's happening out there at the moment, and this is the wedge that's dividing us. And I think we, as the Australian people, all who belong here now, really need to do something and put a line under this. And we can fuss about the how of it, but we need to get that thing across the line, no matter what. Because if we don't,
heaven help us.
It's going to be, look, we're all going to be dead and buried.
Us, yeah.
It's going to be that young lass's grandkids are going to bring them in, right? And that's not okay. We can't keep pushing this off.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the attempt to undermine the voice argument is to say to white Australia, you've got to pass judgment on the detail of this program. That's not what it's about. It's about addressing a moral failure and making that right, and then the detail will be resolved. I mean, it's sort of pretty simple, really. Yeah. I think that one of the things that's coming through in what both of you are saying is that there's a sort of threshold question, and that is, what sort of country do we want to be? What sort of society do we want to be? Now, that was a discussion that has gone through various phases in the life of this nation, of being an active discussion, one that gets resolved, moves to another layer, and then closes down. But one of the other things that, and I'm not being partisan in this, I'm just reporting it, that one of the things that John Howard said very early in his prime ministership was that we were sick of the endless conversation about national identity. Now, he might have been, but actually there was an appetite that was, that was still there. We slow it down a bit. But what we've had now for the last 25 years is that national conversation hasn't been happening. It's been happening in atomised groups and in little community sections and all, various other areas. But the national conversation has been shut down. And so that makes it very difficult, to articulate what it is that we want to be if we've not had the means for having that sort of formal conversation. And I think that's in a way, what is the question that you need to ask that makes that something that we can take quite seriously with a serious openness to different outcomes, not just more of the same.
So there's two things to that. Firstly, most of us in this room and most of our ancestors were not at the table when the Australian Constitution was built, right? If you're a female, seriously, if you come in the last few generations, you're not represented in the Constitution, right? And so that has to change. Now, we have to grip up what the birth of this nation is about. And we have a real opportunity now of saying, all right, we are going to develop a way of being the proper place that is so proud of being on a country that's had 60,000 years of continuous and evolving civilisation, and we all belong here now as part of that story. The second thing is that the conversations have been happening, right? They've been happening in Aboriginal communities. And you've got the Uluru Statement, and that was done by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And that was not something that came out of the clear blue sky out of 2 weeks. That is something that's come out of many clear blue skies over decades, and some would say hundreds of years. And so what you have is a distillation of generations of thought and knowledge and of almost 1 million people, right? It's a lot of people, a lot of thought, and there might be a bit of squabbling around the edges, but ultimately we need to have a place in this land because we've looked after it for 60,000 years and you're expected to look after it for the next 60,000 years, right? So there has to be that reckoning, there has to be that place where we say the conversations have gone on. They've been happening at your kitchen tables, they've been happening at all of your places as well, they've been happening in our universities. That's why we're so committed to growing Aboriginal capability. I mean, I'm a graduate of the 90s, that's only recent decades. And so stuff has been happening and we have to own that and we have to be proud of that. That's not a deficit approach. That is absolutely looking at accentuating what we have done. But now's the time for us to really push on and do what it takes. And the power of the pen is important. And how you engage with your politicians, how it is you engage with the media, your letters to the editor, to your respected professional journals and to various royal societies. This is the power of your voice. And this is where you can really get something happening. Because, seriously, we are at a precipice in Australia. And how we act now and where we'll go to in the next 10 years depends on people like you and me in this room doing something.
But it is that thing about pushing it from those small local, conversations to that next level. I mean, I don't know, Ariadne, have you got some... You're an expert in all this space. How does that happen?
That's an easy question.
I was still sitting on, I don't know if I want to talk about national identity, but I'd rather talk about the common good. And but even I was thinking about that because it's interesting. There is still contestations around there. that irons out difference and how we actually talk through and with difference and with our diversity to come to sort of what are the common things that we think are important, which totally means valuing our deep history. The small to the larger. I mean, the obvious example is what's happened with the sort of kitchen table, the kitchen cabinet conversations in more formal politics that did lead to independent MPs standing, particularly in rural parts of Australia. I'd kind of differentiate them now from the inner city teals. I think they're motivated in quite different ways, although they used some of those similar local organising techniques where they were having conversations with people not based on traditional political ideologies, but based on what kinds of things people wanted to see change. And then they kind of scaled from there. And then it also became seamless between the way they used online organising and the kind of offline community organising as well. So again, it's, I guess, what's your theory of change? What do you want to see happen? How do you build to getting there on the way?
Thank you very much. I think we're right on time. It's 5 o'clock. So thank you very much.
Well, what a day. I'll only take up 1 more minute, but it's important to thank Julianne for carrying the day. She knew it was going to be hard. I knew it was going to be harder, and I'll have to ask her later where it stood on her assessment of the energy that was required, but I think she's done a fabulous job. And thank you, of course, to our final panel and to Lisa and Ariadne, and especially Lisa for performing with such consummate skill, having only been contacted yesterday when Marsha was unable to attend because of her health. And I promised that we will go back in this digital world and amend the program so that forevermore you will be on the program, and Marsha will be there as an apology. So thank you very much. Peter Shergold spoke about the number of learning profiles that we create during a lifetime. I thought it was a very good phrase. And I think today I've created at least 6 of my own, 1 for each of the 5 sessions, and the other related to how to be a community activist. I realised that each and every one of us here is a community activist. All of the volunteers that have contributed to this through the society and through the 5 learned academies are volunteers and, by definition, community activists. Everyone else in the audience, including the students, the past officials of academies and certainly of the society, the past presidents, of which we have 4 in the room, we're all community activists. All of our speakers are activists. So as the introduction to the program said, the aim of today was to show how greater community participation might impact long-term policy development for the benefit of all Australians. And we've heard some wonderful examples of that actually happening, but also some challenges about what else needs to be done to reshape Australia for the better. So, you've got no excuse when you leave this room. You're now empowered with all of the learning profiles you need to make your own individual and collective contribution and impact to and on a better Australia. So thank you all for coming. Congratulations to all of the speakers, to all of the organisers, and for every one of you who has stayed for the drinks.